Hey, welcome to another McBike fly tying video. In this video I actually signed up for a fly swap on Spay Pages, and it's supposed to be a winter fly, winter steelheading fly. So it's going to be on a shank, and I'll kind of explain how it's a new pattern, something I kind of just made up off my head as I went along, and I'll sort of explain it as we go. So first thing, this is a Spirit River, I think they call it an ultra heavy shank or something like that. But it can be anything. You could bend a hook straight. You could tie this on a tube. Whatever works for you. These are. I thought with a winter fly, I'm going to weight it a little anyways. So this has already got some weight to it. So seemed like a good candidate to me. And the thing I like about these, you can also do it with a hook if you actually straighten it out too. This is an HMH tube fly adapter, and I find they fit really well in these. So first thing I'm going to do, just going to lay down a bit of a layer of thread, and so in the swap I have to tie 12 of these, and they're supposed to all kind of be the same. So I have one already done up, and I'm just going to refer to it every once in a while just to get my lengths correct. When I did these up, this is the last one I'm doing actually. When I did them up originally, what I did was just did up a whole bunch of shanks all in one go. So to rig it up, we're going to be using sinuous intruder wire, which is a steel braided wire coated in plastic. What I like to do is I actually like to run it on the hook first. And so what I do is I put it on the hook, and I'll make sure that I can just barely slip the hook over the back. I don't like to run it much longer than that, just because you know, there's sort of rumors that if you run too long of a hook, you can too long of a trailer, sorry, you can damage fish more easily. And so I just think, well, might as well just do them up nice and short. It puts the hook right at the back of the material anyways, which is where I want it. And it also allows me, if I put the hook on now, I can kind of just give everything a bit of a pull, make sure I don't lengthen it out too much, and that'll keep everything in the alignment I want when I'm done. So now, quickly run my thread back up, keeping the hook or the wire on top. And I'm going to do that to about there. And then what I'm going to do, take my wire, thread it back through the eye and back. Now this is probably don't need to do this. This is probably a little more extra security than you really need, but that's kind of just what has become standard practice for me. So the stuff that you run back, try and keep it running on the bottom. Bring your thread up to the front and back. The thread I'm using for this step is Uni Big Fly. It only comes in a few colors, but it's a very tough thread. And I've already pre-cut the wire to length. I normally like it to come just back to where the return eye ends up. If you do have to cut this wire, don't use your good scissors, obviously. Use an old pair or something like that. And then I'm just going to quickly whip finish this off. Hand whip finish is easier because you're kind of way in the back here. Now you could, if you wanted the really like skookum extra security, you could run down a layer of head cement, Zap-A-Gap, anything like that on there. I don't really feel that's necessary at this point, but it is something that you could do if you really wanted to. Oops, I forgot. So like I said, this is a weighted fly. So on top of the fact that I'm using a shank, I am going to put a little bit of lead on there. Not too much. Just a tiny bit of weight. So what I've kind of thought of for this fly, and this is kind of how my thought process goes on things, I want this for slower moving flows but it's a winter fly, so we're going to be fishing deep buckets, slower moving flows. So some weight, but not a ridiculous amount. So that looks like a fair amount of turns, but this is only 0.15 lead, so not overly thick, not a lot of weight going on there. And then we'll just throw some thread wraps on it. So what I like to do when I do on top of lead is I go on an angle across it, and you can see that, and that builds up. Otherwise what happens is your thread kind of just drops in between the lead, and it doesn't really seem to do much in terms of securing it on. Okay, so this is a uni thread 6/0 in white, and the reason I'm using white you'll see in a few minutes. So this is, like I said, designed to be kind of a slower flow but deep fishing fly. Kind of designed it to look a little bit like a the thought process was sort of like a chunk of, like a flesh fly, or a bit like an egg at the back. I don't know if it really turned out like that or not, but I think it's a nice look. But you can decide when it's all done up. So first thing we're going to do, just going to put a little bump at the back, nothing major, just to give my, there's going to be a little bit of marabou at the back, just to give it a little bit of a prop. And also we're going to put on some grizzly hackle there, and just to give it a bit of a flare on the back. Next thing I want to do, just a little bit of polar chenille as kind of a almost like a veil over top of this. So I've got the polar chenille in, and as I'm going to pull that back, it just reminded me of this hook sitting here. This is the only thing. You can just take this off if you wanted. I kind of just tend to leave them on there. But what I do is I take a little piece of junction tubing, stick it on the hook point like that. Now as I'm pulling back my polar chenille, I won't catch myself in the finger as I have done far too many times before I got a little bit smarter. So each time you give this a turn, stroke back all the fibers, and what we're trying to do is sort of create a little bit of a veil, kind of enhance the bump a little bit as well. And we're just going to tie that off, pull everything back. So clip our material, pull everything back, tidy it up a little bit. Okay, the next thing we're going to add in here is just 2 grizzly hackles that are just going to kind of wiggle in behind the fly. Now, this is one of the things I'm really big on. So I've got this little tiny short bit of grizzly hackle here that was left over from doing another one of these, and I really don't see, especially when it's just showing up at the back of the fly, any point in wasting this. So all I'm going to do is just take my scissors, turn the feather upside down, and coming from the point this way, it seems to be the easiest. I'm just going to give it a little bit of a tip so it looks a little bit more like it did in the first place. Grab my previously done fly so it's approximately the same length. And I actually like this a little better, getting the root sort of this hackle, because it's a little bit thicker too, which I kind of like the look of for this sort of a thing. Sometimes the tips on these grizzly hackles can be quite skinny, so I think if you want it to be seen sort of wiggling in the back, I kind of like a little bit thicker look. So I'm going to grab my second one, tie it up for length, and pop that puppy on. See, this is what, you know, the last one was left from, but obviously that one's a little too short to do anything with. Tidy up a little bit. Now you could leave it like that if you want. I did happen to put on another little step, just something a little more to entice it at the back. Okay, so what I've got is some Lady Amherst center tail. And I'm just going to clip out a little section of that. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to tie in 4 bits of 2. and this can be a little tedious, so just separate it out. Just take your bodkin, measure out to separate them off. And I try and work with the curve of the feather a little bit. It's kind of getting a little silly, but to work a little bit towards the inside so it doesn't just sit out at a funny angle. So we're going to do 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, and like I said, it's just another little hit of color, something to give the back of the fly a little more attraction. We're trying to get them to hit up the back of the fly. Obviously it's where the business end is. Okay, so there we go. 2 top, 2 bottom. Next step is just a little bit of orange marabou, and just wanted to talk briefly about marabou. So you might see a feather like this and think it's all thick and ugly and no good, but so you want to take a quick look at it, and you'll see on a lot of these there's like kind of a secondary piece on top at the base. So we'll start by pulling that off. And what I find with marabou, the key, so we wanted this to be somewhat sparse. We're looking for movement, but I want what's underneath there to show through. So I find the key with marabou, when you want to tie it sparse, still want some movement, you want it to be long. First of all, remove all the fluff off the bottom, whatever you don't want. And we're not going to tie this in by the tip. So if you look at the tip, that's where all our shorter fibers are. If we tie that in by the tip, we'll have to do quite a few wraps to get to the longer stuff at the back. And by the time we do that, it'll be quite thick. So what I'm going to do, basically pull all these feathers back, and we're going to tie it in from the root instead, which is sort of opposite to how you do most other hackles. So pop it on by the root. I like to tie these in a fair way forwards, why not? Get it good and secure. I'm going to give that a little bit of a kink in the stem. And then the fly tier's favorite tool. Wet your fingers down, especially with marabou. This stuff is so unruly. Basically you're just kind of folding it back, but you're also making it so that it's going to stay somewhat ruly. So like I said, we're trying to tie this somewhat sparse. We don't want to get ridiculous with a whole bunch of wraps. I think we're going to do 2 wraps max, and it looks a little bit sparse there, but that's what I'm going for. And also it's wet right now too, so it's going to be a little even more sparse. So wrap it up, fold it back, wrap back. Again, like I said, when you're taking the time to build a fly like this, it's nice if it lasts a little while. Take your time, tie it in well, snip your tip off. I'm not even going to bother to clean that up too much because we're going to cover that up. Okay, so next is going to be our hackle and body materials, or body hackle. So I've selected a, it's called burnt spay hackle. I think this happens to be by Superfly, and I'm going to do another video on this later on how to prepare these. So basically you're kind of splitting them into 2 halves, and it's the only way to make them really workable, because otherwise the stem is too thick and they're not really doable. So the trick, even when you use them after you've split them all, sit them in water, warm water, not hot, because hot pulls the color out a little more, with a little bit of decent quality, just mild dish soap, and I find that gives them a little bit of their life back, makes them a little more supple. The bleaching or burning process, as they call it, which removes the barbules, this is goose shoulder is what burnt spay hackle is, and the bleaching process makes them fairly brittle. Plus the stems are usually quite thick, and then you're going to split it in half. So that causes no end of problems when you go to wrap things. So we just wet it down with a bit of soap, and that's going to just restore some of the suppleness to that. Now the body material is a hairline flat diamond braid in pearl. So I'm going to tie that in. This stuff has a tendency to sort of unravel at the tip, so I tie it in fairly forward and then go back over it. And when I'm going back over it, this is why we've done the white. Materials underneath do tend to shine through this stuff a little bit. Just dropped a couple fibers in there. So I'm going to do the white body on with the thread just so we don't get quite so much shine through of any orange marabou, the lead, or anything like that. If you did the black, if you did normal sort of black thread, I think you'd end up with quite a bit of shine through. Covering up our intruder wire, and we're not going very far forward to the tip. We need quite a bit of room at the front of this fly for a number of things. So do a little half hitch because I've got a rotary vise. Personally, I find this the easiest way to apply this type of material because it's not fragile, but it does fray fairly easily. So my hackle's going to get in my way. Lovely. There we go, wet it down. And slightly overlapping, and we're just going to work this forward, kind of holding your finger, holding it flat on your fingers as you go so it stays nice and flat, doesn't spin, twist I should say. Okay, ready your cradle and tie it off. I'm not sure I have quite enough room there at the head, so I'm just going to come back a bit. I'd rather have too much room than not enough. Alright, so we're going to bring forward our hackle, and part of the reasoning on this hackle was actually to give the fly just a little more support. Marabou obviously doesn't have much support on its own, so trying to create something that can give it a little bit of support to give more of a teardrop sort of shape to things. And as we come forward, the idea is to hopefully get one full turn of hackle up at the front, which we did. That's good. And you can see how the stems, even at half thickness, they thick up. They get pretty thick pretty quick on these goose shoulders. And just separate that. It's kind of sticking to itself because it's all wet. Just separate that out. It's not, I mean, this doesn't provide a lot of support. It's still a fairly soft material. It's why they use it as it's like a spay hackle, because it's long and sort of flowing hackle, but it does help maintain a little bit of a teardrop shape. So the next thing we're going to do to help maintain our shape a little bit more, we're going to put on a little more dubbing. And this dubbing, by the way, is it's a mixture of UV ice dub in UV shrimp pink and orange, as well as just a tiny bit of this other stuff called super bright orange, which is just something I'm trying to get rid of. So every time I do up a fly that has any orange, I throw a little in there when it doesn't matter too much, like in this where I'm just doing a dubbing ball. So I get the sparkle. Fairly decent sized dubbing ball. Pick off our extra. Okay, so next is just a little hit of pink. So you can see I'm kind of going flesh colors here, orange, pink. So just a little hit of pink, not a lot. Marabou again, tied in by the root. Okay, and like I said, I tend to put a little bit of a bend into these just to get it to cooperate where I want it to go when I'm doing it. Wet your fingers down, fold your hackle back, and wrap. And we're just, like I said, very sparse on this particular one, just a little bit. Two wraps on the tip, fold it back. you can kind of go over things just a little bit, press it into that dubbing ball, and that's going to flare it out a little bit more. Pull your tip out. You can either break it off, or I prefer just to clip it. Make sure you don't clip too much of the rest when you're doing that. So you can see when it's just a tiny bit, just to give it a little bit of pink hit in there. Okay, next thing we're going to do is just quickly finish off our thread, and we're going to switch to black, which is our head color. We've got our body done now, so we'll use our final color. I may have given myself a little too much room there, but like I said, I'd rather have too much than not enough, and it doesn't really bother me on these shank flies anyways. The heads, for whatever reason, I tend to get them fairly big and ugly on these shank flies. It's just the way life ends up being. Okay. Okay, next is a guinea feather. I really like guinea as a prop. You see it in the hobo spay. It winds up the body, and then they do another one on top. I think it has a fair amount of stiffness to it. It really seems to like to stand up nicely. It does give some neat contrast too. You know, with the dots make kind of a nice barring effect. Tie it in well. Bring your thread back. Fold your hackle. And I just kind of give it a pinch to do this. Other people like to run their scissors up the hackle, which is another good way to do it. So you just take your scissor and you just run it up like that to fold it. I don't like doing it that way. I don't know why. Other people, that's their preference. So we're just going to wrap one turn in front of the other, keep folding our hackle back as we go, and we're going to try and use the full feather on this. Guinea also has a habit of getting quite thick towards the stems, so we want to be careful of that. So 90-degree bend into there, wrap it forward, a couple wraps, front, boom, cut that off. Okay, and our last piece. So, like I said, sort of a fleshy fly, give this a bit of a rotting flesh look. The last thing just has some, wanted to give it some movement, give it a bit of a graying sort of fleshy look. This is kind of how my thought process goes. I try to think what I'm trying to accomplish, and then I don't know if I ever get there in the end or if I just overthink it, but that's what I do. So again, another marabou jail house, I think they call this, but basically barred white marabou. Nice stuff for adding a lot of movement to your fly. Marabou in particular is really good. Like I said, this was designed for slightly slower flows. In really heavy flows, obviously, unless you have quite a substantial prop, the whole thing just floats, or just streams right back. But in a slightly slower flow, it really pulsates. I mean, you can see how wispy that is. It really just pulsates in the water, which is awesome. Add in the barring, and you've got a fly with a lot of movement. And if you think of sort of a dying, rotting piece of fish going by, it kind of has that same sort of just undulating movement to it. So again, not too much on this. Trying to keep the whole thing a little sparse. Maybe I'll do one more. That's a little too much. Just do a part. Keep that wrap back. Let's see. One more. No, I think that's good. Cross your thread. Pull everything back. And this stuff is really annoying at the head at this point because it does this where it kind of builds up on top, but that's okay, we're going to deal with that in a second. Okay, so grab your tip, cut it off. So you see how much nicer that is though when you tie it in by the root. You get all that long, lengthy fiber you want without having to first tie in all this extra material. That would have just added so much more bulk, and it doesn't give us any sort of length or benefit that we were looking for there anyways. Okay, so next thing I like to do, just trim any tiny bits of fuzz that are sticking out here, which is really the annoyance of marabou. This white stuff in particular seems to be kind of fluffy. Pull it all back again. And then all we have to do is build up a head. And we're just going to try and carefully cover up as much of the marabou as we can. And if you have a rotary vise, now is a good time to just take a quick peek on the bottom. Make sure you're getting it all. Flatten out your thread if you need to. And like I said, on these flies, I don't worry too much if I'm building up a big head. It's not a show fly, it's not a classic fly, it's just a winter fishing fly. You're going to lose them on the bottom. You can do all kinds of things with them. Okay, so whip finish. And the last thing we have to do is throw on some head cement there, and we're all done. Okay, so our last step, if you've tied this on a shank like I have, these long shanks, or on a straightened out hook, you have to do this step. If you've tied it on something like a Waddington shank or a fish skulls shank, then you don't need to do this. But obviously you need to cut off this wire. So the first step, peel back everything, including the intruder wire, very important. Take some cutters, make sure you don't have the intruder wire in there. I've done that before and then wrecked a nice tie. So now you've got a kind of a rough cut here, so you want to do one of two things. So either you want to file that smooth with a file, or I've actually got these little, and this is probably impossible to see, these little plastic things that go on the end of earrings. They're called plastic earring backers. You can get them at the craft store. And I just stick it right on the end of the fly like that, and that's going to protect the wire from getting, it's probably not going to get torn up by that stuff anyways, but that's what I do that for. And yeah, there we go. Hopefully that fly works for you.